Hello, and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts, on WELT 95.7 FM, broadcasting from the Allen County Public Library. My name is Chris Rex. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about how global climate, can we change it? That's one of those topics where a lot of people seem to feel like they can contribute to, or at least know something about, as far as whether we as human beings are changing the climate. So that's the question, is it possible for us to change the climate of the entire planet? We're just a small part of the planet, even though we are much bigger than many of the other organisms on this planet. Not all of them, but many of them. And so it's really a question of, well, how much do we, as being small things in numbers around 7 billion, how do we feel like we can impact the entire environment of the planet? And really what that comes down to is a fundamental question that relates to all organisms. Is it possible for any organism to impact the climate of the entire planet? Okay, so we're just going to take a step back here for a second. Ignore humans, because I know we think we're so awesome and special and amazing and whatever. We're really not in many ways. But we're going to ignore humans for a second. And we're going to step back and we're going to take a look at the most fundamental, smallest organisms that are out there. That is to say, the bacteria. Now, normally when we think of bacteria, we think about things that cause disease in humans. Whether they're causing some sort of permanent damage to our bodies or even death, we tend to think of them as more of a pest than we do anything else in the world. Even though really it's only because of bacteria that we have anything to eat. See, we as being animals, being meat-eating animals in particular, we really need other organisms to live on. And those other organisms really require some other organism in order to produce the food that they then can take advantage of. For instance, even if you go entirely vegetarian or vegan, you rely upon some sort of organism to make sugars, generally in the form of glucose, or some derivation thereof, and you would eat that organism after it made those sugars. And generally speaking, those organisms make those sugars through a process that we call photosynthesis, whereby those organisms are able to absorb energy from the sunlight using certain pigments and things of that nature in order to try to convert that energy, that light energy, into chemical energy, and in order to create the bonds that result in the molecules of sugar that we then consume. So regardless of where you want to start at on the chain, you inevitably have to rely on these first organisms that take light energy and create chemical bonds from it. That's what we're really going to focus on for the first part of this talk. Okay. So we have to realize that in the beginning, most notably of the Earth, we're talking about 4.6 billion years ago. In the beginning, we're really thinking of an environment that was very, very hostile towards any living thing. Okay. The Earth was basically a molten ball floating through space. All right, very, very hectic. A lot of volcanic activity. The ground itself was basically just recently cooled lava, essentially, because we basically had volcanic eruptions constantly. And with those volcanic eruptions, they are actually what ended up forming the first atmosphere of our planet. If we think about what's typically found in a volcanic eruption, you'll obviously have some sulfur containing molecules, some sulfuric gases, so to speak, some nitric gases, and you'll also have other more familiar things like methane and carbon dioxide and water vapor. Well, those sorts of things are really what dominated the early atmosphere of the Earth. What that resulted in was an environment that was very hostile towards anything resembling life developing. However, it still ended up planting the seeds, so to speak, so that life could eventually evolve once the Earth had calmed down a little bit. All right. Gotta think that the Earth was very, very torrential at this time period, with all those volcanoes going off, with everything still shifting and getting used to being in place, with the moon forming as well, which is another event entirely that we're not going to talk about right now. Just know that a large astral body slammed into Earth while it was forming, and that's how we have the moon. So, a crazy time. Crazy time. Needless to say, we finally start calming down. About 1 billion years of time passes, and we finally get something that resembles life. Complex life, at that. And when I say complex, I'm really trying to get at the point that the simplest form of life only takes 5 nucleotides to form. Nucleotides which we have found in every place in the galaxy. You know, I just mentioned this in the previous episode in the talk. You know, it's really of no surprise that we find these basic building blocks for life in all sorts of places in the universe. But what we're talking about in this instance is a prokaryotic organism. That is to say, for those of you who don't remember your freshman biology class, prokaryotic organisms are those that basically have a cell wall followed by a cell membrane, and basically inside that cell all you have is a long thready piece of DNA and some cytoplasm. That's about it. There's really not a whole lot in that cell, so to speak. It's a very, very simplistic mechanism where you have the DNA, or RNA as it would be, and that DNA basically governs everything in the cell, but it doesn't necessarily have to belong inside of a structure, which is to say inside of a nucleus. Given that we don't have DNA inside of a nucleus, that kind of frees us to do a number of things that we wouldn't normally be able to do. For example, one of the things that bacteria are able to do is they're able to take advantage of certain compounds in certain respects that allow them to take energy from the sun and create chemical energy. This is where the first bacteria that started producing organic compounds come from. These bacteria in particular were called cyanobacteria. These guys were really the more advanced form. Okay, not many people have heard about the predecessors to cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria were actually the more modern forms, and these guys were the ones that do basically things that we would normally think of photosynthetic organisms like plants doing. In a very stereotypical manner, they were able to take light from the sun, and they were able to create organic compounds like glucose, like sugars. The first compounds, however, or the first bacterial organisms that actually evolved on the planet, weren't necessarily like that. Okay, they actually produced a number of sulfuric containing compounds. They actually didn't necessarily absorb the visible light spectrum. They absorbed the near-infrared spectrum. Okay, so they were a little different. And really that came down to the bacterial chlorophylls that they contained within the bacterial cells themselves. So they were photosynthetic bacteria, but these guys really only appeared about 3.4 billion years ago, and they didn't necessarily do the types of processes that we normally associate with photosynthesis. But then, Give them 0.7 billion years or 700 million years, however you want to look at it, and that's where we see those first cyanobacteria. Okay. Now I mention those first and foremost because those are really the guys who do photosynthesis the way photosynthesis is meant to be done. Which is to say, the more evolved form where we take light energy in the presence of a couple different compounds, most notably carbon dioxide and water, and we combine those sorts of things in order to form glucose and oxygen. That's really how photosynthesis works. You put in carbon dioxide, you put in water, you have everything take place during sunlight, and look at that, you end up getting glucose and oxygen. That's really what photosynthesis is, and that's the fundamental thing that allows life to happen on this entire planet. Without photosynthesis, it would be very, very difficult to have the diversity of life that we have today. Because there are a number of chemotrophic types of organisms, which is to say organisms that can take advantage of chemical energy that's already there. However, inevitably, those become very, very limited systems. Namely, what we're talking about there is like deep ocean types of systems where you find certain thermophiles that are organisms that can handle high amounts of heat and or salt. Extremophiles is actually the more general term. But yeah, we're not necessarily talking about those guys. We are talking about the photosynthesizers, the autotrophs, so to speak. The ones who generate their own energy. Now I say it in that manner because really every single organism, even if it's a plant or algae or cyanobacteria, every single organism still has to use energy. And unfortunately, that's a fact that most people tend to forget. Even I forget that sometimes. It's natural. You know, it's not like you're playing a video game where something produces, you're building a city and you have something that produces energy and that's all that does. You know, even if we look at human society, even power plants, any type of power plant, requires energy to some degree. Every single one of them. Whether it be a windmill that we're making, whether it be a solar cell that we're making, whether it be a coal-fired power plant, or whether it be a nuclear plant. All of those plants, all of those energy producers require energy to run. It's not any different at the biological level. It's the same story. It's just in this case, we also have to keep in mind that the cell has to stay alive. And in order to stay alive, you have to use energy. There is no way around that. As such, we can start thinking about these costs of photosynthesis. And we'll actually come back to that here again later on. Anyway, we have these photosynthetic bacteria, the cyanobacteria, doing their thing about 2.7 billion years ago. Well, it only takes a couple 100 million years for us to start having appreciable amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere. Which is to say, we can look back at the rock record, and see the geological history of the Earth and find places where we know the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere had to be at a certain level in order for us to see the level of chemical reactions that we're seeing with the rock that existed and were exposed at that time. Okay, cool. So we know that oxygen levels were starting to increase at that time period because really at the beginning of the Earth, there wasn't really much oxygen to be found. So it's really the effect of these cyanobacteria over a couple million years, couple 100 million years, that produced this increase in atmospheric oxygen. Now, that was kind of a stepping stone that certain other organisms took advantage of. All right. Most notably, we started to see more complex forms of photosynthetic life that we most commonly know as algae. Right. They actually ended up coming into the playing field, so to speak, about 1.2 billion years ago. so it did take quite a long period of time for them to appear. But algae, we all know algae. We've all seen algae. A number of us that have ponds in the back of their places, we apply certain treatments to the pond to get rid of the algae, because otherwise algae can become kind of out of control. But we also think about some of the good things that algae does, which is, once again, produces oxygen, because it's also a very photosynthetic thing. When we look at it, we see that it's green. Well, the green color is really a result of the chloroplasts that are inside of it. Now, those chloroplasts, having a chloroplast indicates that you are no longer a prokaryotic organism. Now we're talking about eukaryotic organisms, which is to say organisms that are very complex, organisms that have what we call mini organelles inside of them, which are basically tiny little structures that mimic the function of certain organs in a larger animal like us. Okay. They most certainly have a number of structures that do certain functions that can be kind of analogous to certain things that we do. Which is to say, they have chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are basically tiny little photosynthetic organisms that were prokaryotic that then became endosymbiotic with a eukaryotic cell. So when we think about a eukaryotic cell, it's really just a conglomeration of different endosymbiotic events with chloroplasts and with mitochondria. Mitochondria are actually the cells that do the opposite of chloroplasts. Instead of producing energy from the sun via photosynthesis like chloroplasts do, using their various chlorophylls and pigments and things, what mitochondria do is they actually take in the results of photosynthesis, aka the sugars like glucose and such, and they sit there and break them down with the assistance of oxygen. Which is why when we think about the two parts of a eukaryotic cell, just like our own, those two parts in a cell, like the algae, they are actually basically they have to kind of coordinate with one another, right? So the algae has to produce energy so they can use that energy using the mitochondria. We always have to think of this balance in the photosynthetic organisms like algae, that there is this balance between these two forces. Now, there's not a balance between those two forces in us because we don't have chloroplasts. Unfortunately, if we sit out in the sun, no matter how long we're out in the sun, we never produce energy. Okay. We might generate certain other compounds in the body, like vitamin D and folate, but we're not touching that right now. Anyway, if we think about the evolution of algae into what we know as plants, well, that took another couple 100 million years. All right, about 700 million years ago, that's where we really see plants appearing. Now, when we think of plants first appearing, they're really in this very primitive stage, so they're very shrubby, they're very low to the ground, and that's really because they don't have vascular tissue yet. Right? It took another couple 100 million years in order to develop vascular tissue or evolve vascular tissue in plants so that they can grow to the heights that we now see as trees and big tall shrubs. That requires vascular tissue. Other small shrubby things, including ferns and such, certain ferns, those are really very primitive types of organisms. Now, around this time that plants appear, we also see an explosion in animal life. Okay, just a little time after plants appear, we see a whole lot of animals come out and start speciating and radiating from the organisms that were present at that time. And we see a whole lot of diversity occur. Just really cool, really crazy. But this is what we call the Cambrian explosion, which is to say it was during the Cambrian period of time, about 500 million years ago or so, 550 I think actually, and this is where all modern phyla of organisms appear, which is to say, taxonomically speaking, most types of animals start generating from this point in time. And we know this from, once again, fossil records, DNA records, all sorts of different sources here that all collaborate on the same types of time frames. So this is a pretty well supported thing. Going on and trying to think about what the atmosphere was along the way, once again, we didn't start out with much oxygen in the atmosphere. But 2.4 billion years ago, just after the cyanobacteria evolved, that's where we really started seeing that atmospheric oxygen. And it actually took another 1.5 billion years for those oxygen levels to reach about 5%. Okay, if we think about how that compares with modern day oxygen levels in the atmosphere are about 21%. And if we think about CO2, it's not this huge percentage that it was way back in the day. It is actually about 0.04%, which is not very much. Not very much at all. There's a whole lot of oxygen compared to CO2 in the atmosphere. But one of the other significant things that the cyanobacteria and some of these first organisms that were really complex and really started doing some fun things, some of the results of those organisms weren't necessarily just limited to taking in CO2 and producing oxygen. Okay, because that's really what the cyanobacteria specialized in. However, they had a secondary function too, because the early atmosphere also had a lot of nitrogen. Given a lot of nitrogen, we need some way to take that nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into a form, into a solid form or into a liquid form that other organisms can then access. These other organisms must be able to access this because they need it in order to do the basic things that organisms do. To start with, you need to be able to replicate your DNA. DNA consists of a lot of nitrogen compounds. Hence why we call the parts of DNA, the fundamental parts of DNA, nucleotides. They do involve some nitrogen-containing compounds. Additionally, what we can think of is how a lot of creatures consist predominantly of proteins. Given that you're predominantly protein, you require a lot of amino acids. Every single amino acid also requires use of a nitrogen compound of some kind. So between your DNA and basically what makes up most of your body, you need nitrogen for every step of the way. So there's not a whole lot that life can do without nitrogen, which is why it was so important for organisms to come into, to evolve, basically, and come onto the scene so that they can serve this purpose, this very, very important purpose of taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and then sequestering it into some sort of solid or liquid form that other creatures can then utilize. Most notably, they would sequester this into like ammonia or ammonium, some sort of form like that. And then other creatures can utilize it. So that's good. That's great. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that when we look at today's oxygen levels, we had mentioned before that it was about 21%. Well, we have to keep in mind where humans are really ideal at is somewhere between 19.5% and 23.5%. So 21% is actually pretty perfect. Pretty perfect for humans, so to speak. Unfortunately, that's only necessarily true at sea level. Okay? Because although the percent of the atmosphere pretty much stays the same for most of the altitudes that humans can exist at or visit, the percentage really doesn't change much. What does change is the density of the particles at those different altitudes. Which is to say, when we are at 15,000 feet, we don't necessarily experience the same density of oxygen particles as we do at 0 feet above sea level. The reasoning for that is that at 0 feet above sea level, you experience about 1 atmosphere of pressure. Now, 1 atmosphere of pressure greatly decreases as you increase in altitude. So with less dense particles, that basically means that although, yeah, theoretically the air at 21,000 feet or at 15,000 feet, theoretically the air is still 21% oxygen. It's just that the number of oxygen particles at that atmospheric level, or at that altitude level, is, some marked percentage less than that at 0 atmospheres. So let's just say, for instance, it's 30% less. 30% fewer particles are present at 15,000 feet than they are at 0 feet. Well, guess what? That means that your body is going to be 30% more starved for oxygen than it normally would be, which causes your body to do some certain things. If we think about the physiological responses that the human body has to the environment, we can think of, well, maybe there's an increase in breathing rate, right? You start breathing heavier, you start breathing more often. So, okay, increase in breathing rate and depth. You can also think of your heart beating faster in order to try to more efficiently pump oxygen to the tissues that need it as soon as they need it. You can also think of other things though. Okay. Over longer periods of time, you start having certain physiological responses in your body where your kidneys receive a signal to start secreting more erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that travels to your bone marrow and signals your bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Once that signal is made, then your bone marrow starts making more red blood cells and you start having, quote, thicker blood. Which is great because that'll help you at higher altitude. However, having thicker blood starts turning it into a sludge and makes you more prone to have things like heart attacks and lethal blood clots that end up going to your lungs, forming some sort of pulmonary embolism or something, or even to your brain and having a cerebral stroke. So those types of things can certainly happen when you have thicker blood. But in general, thicker blood isn't going to harm you. Okay, if you're just going up to 12,000 feet, climbing the mountains in Colorado, that probably won't hurt you too much. Okay. Now, it obviously depends on your health and everything there, but really, we can adapt to that height. Another thing that tends to happen, in addition to more blood cells, more red blood cells, is that we tend to have more vascularization in your tissues, which is to say, angiogenesis occurs pretty much systemically. Okay, so to make sure that your body not only has enough blood by increasing the heart rate and increasing the breathing rate, increasing the number of red blood cells so you have more hemoglobin floating around, but we also make sure to penetrate your tissues with more vascular tissue, arteries and veins, in order to more efficiently service the needs of your tissues. Okay. So by going to a higher altitude and doing strength training or training for the Olympics or something, you can certainly have certain advantages that will give you maybe the edge in a sport. And that's why a lot of people go to these sorts of training centers that are up in the mountains or whatever, in order to strength train or endurance train for these sports. Because it will cause your body to make these physiological changes that will help you performance-wise in these various sports. Alright, let's go back to the history of Earth and think about one of the most significant events that happened during the early history of Earth. Now, actually, I'm not talking about early history, I'm really just talking about before human history. So it's kind of early history, but not early history. So really just saying before human history. How about that? And one of these events was the third mass extinction to ever strike the planet. This was called the Permian-Triassic extinction event. or PT event. This happened about 250 million years ago or so, and this was an event that wiped out more species than all the other extinction events. Okay. This wiped out 96% of all marine species, 70% of all vertebrate terrestrial species, and 83% of all insect genera, which is to say, a whole lot of creatures in every single category. That's really what we're saying here. If we think about the outcome from that whole event, we would normally think of not much being left over and not much being able to come out of such an event. But alas, it was actually that event that kind of led up to the generation of the dinosaurs. Okay, so even though it devastated so much life, it was such a horrific event, it was actually one of the catalysts necessary in order to generate the dinosaurs that we love and enjoy today. Right up until they got extinct during another extinction event some odd millions of years later. Going back to that particular event though, as far as what caused it, we tend to think about certain causes as being kind of typical for these extinction events, right? We think of something like an asteroid or meteor impact, followed by maybe some secondary devastation from global climate change or volcanic eruptions. Things of that nature are really kind of the typical causal factors that we look at in these extinction events. Now, certain other factors have been considered in the past, such as, well, maybe for some of these extinctions in the past, because we've had 5 of them thus far, maybe for some of these extinctions we've had an event where a black hole actually irradiated the planet. Okay, some sort of pulsar, basically, with an extremely concentrated, like laser type of beam of radiation, washed over the planet and cleared out a lot of its life forms. Those sorts of things have been hypothesized. However, the really hardcore things that we've been able to prove normally include asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions. Additionally, with this particular event, there are some other hypotheses as far as some contributing factors to why so many organisms died. One of those contributing factors is the fact that there was a lot of methanogenic bacteria that also proliferated during this time period. Which is to say, these bacteria were bacteria that produced methane. Methane is a great greenhouse gas. It is basically excellent at trapping the Earth's energy in Earth and not allowing it to escape out into space. That may have been just the increase of this one type of bacteria that may have been a contributor to the global warming and to the global extinction of a lot of its creatures. Maybe. It might have had something to do with it. It's one of our hypotheses. So that kind of brings us to modern day, right? To where we're thinking about, well, how does this greenhouse effect kind of impact us today? And what types of things are going on with our planet right now? And I guess I didn't fully explain it before, but when we think about the greenhouse effect, we're thinking of rays of the sun's energy coming through the clouds, coming through the atmosphere, reaching the planet, and some of that energy being absorbed on the planet, of course, but also some of the energy being reflected back out into space. Now, one of the things that's great about doing that is snow, right? If we think about snow, snow is white. If you're wearing a white t-shirt out in the middle of summer, you realize that you're not quite so hot as you would be if you're wearing a black t-shirt. It's the same kind of concept. Wearing a white t-shirt or having white on the ground reflects a lot of the light back out into space. But the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere actually serve as a secondary reflector, to where they reflect some of that heat that's reflected from the ground surface out into space. They reflect some of that heat backwards down to the planet. So you have this kind of rebound effect that goes on with the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And that's what keeps the Earth warm at night. If the Earth didn't have greenhouse gases, we would instantaneously go from really, really hot while in the sun to really, really cold in the shade. And the effect would be almost instantaneous. If we think about how astronauts on the moon made do, it was the same kind of thing for them there too. Right? Where the sunny side of the moon would be so much warmer than the cold side of the moon. And how the transition from warm to cold would happen almost instantaneously. Because the moon has minimal atmosphere to speak of. It's really just kind of a rock. Okay, not really much atmosphere there at all. So that just kind of explains the greenhouse effect in general, because we're really going to be coming back to that here in a second. If we go back to thinking about oxygen levels on the planet, we said that they weren't significant in the beginning, but then they became significant as a result of cyanobacteria. Well, if we really think about where levels have gone from that initial 21% value, once we had a significant time period, progress there and everything, once humans come on the scene, we really see global oxygen levels decreasing by about 2% in the past 60 years. That's pretty crazy. 2% in the past 60 years? All right. And they actually predict another 1 to 7% by 2100. And you sit here and you ask, well, how can that happen? Why are oxygen levels decreasing on the Earth? And you start thinking, well, if the global temperatures are rising, which has been a confirmed phenomena, global average temperatures have risen over the past 100 years by over a degree Celsius. If we think about the implications of that, that has actually reduced the solubility of the Earth's oceans by some degree, which is to say it causes them to release oxygen. So you're thinking, well, that's interesting. So that should increase the level of oxygen in the atmosphere. But then you start taking into account, well, increased temperatures also increase biological activity. And we have some very great graphs that show that, especially in snakes. Snakes have a great curve when it comes to energy use versus temperature. Because snake body temperature is really dependent on their environment, right? So we can have a snake grown in different environments and fed the same thing in those different environments and see how their weights change over time. Which is to say, the snakes that are grown in higher temperature environments don't put on as much weight as those that are grown in lower temperature environments. Now obviously there are thresholds on either end. If you get too high in temperature, you'll kill the snake. If you get too low in temperature, you'll kill the snake. But there's some flexibility in between there. And that's why it's not great to have your snakes exposed to 120 degree heat lamp 24/7. Okay, and that's one of the ways that I kind of disagree with some other fellow reptile keepers. Because I believe that that's a complete waste and actually results in a creature that has many more problems than it does otherwise. Anyway, preventing myself from going off onto a tangent, let's get back to oxygen levels, right? Another thing that we have to consider is that as we increase the temperature of the oceans, paradoxically, we have seen less ocean overturning and mixing, okay, and ventilating. Which is to say that although you would think increasing the temperature differential between the surface water and the deep water would be a good thing, for some reason it's actually a bad thing. And it's actually generating situations where the shallow water is not mixing with the deep water, which means that certain other mechanisms aren't happening. And it's kind of resulting in a snowball effect of horrible bad things. Very, very bad things for marine biologists. I'm not a marine biologist personally. I just know that bad for them, and I'm very sorry for that. Now, going back to atmospheric oxygen, okay, because we were just talking about ocean oxygen, all right? Going to atmospheric oxygen, we have actually seen that decrease by 0.7%, right, in the past 800,000 years. And you're like, well, 0.7%, 800,000 years, that's like an average of 0.1% every 100,000 years. That's not much to worry about. Then you hear the fact that we have decreased that global atmospheric oxygen level by 0.1% in the past 100 years. So you go from a rate that is 0.1% per 100,000 years to a rate that is 0.1% per 100 years. Now you're starting to pay attention. You're like, that's like 1,000 times faster of an oxygen consumption rate in the atmosphere. That starts to worry me a little bit, especially with the fact that, once again, humans are a little sensitive to oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere. So that just kind of shouts to me as being a little problematic. Now, notably, when we look at the sources of some of this decrease, historically, over the past 800,000 years, it's just been because we've had a lot more oxygen sinks than we have sources. That's simple, whatever. But then if we think about what's been happening over that time period, we think of glaciation periods, and we think of everything melting from the glaciation period. And what happens as things melt is that they erode a lot. They erode a lot of rock, they expose a lot of rock. And so from all that, that is actually what's caused this oxygen sinking phenomenon to occur. It's because we expose a lot of rock that basically takes up oxygen from the atmosphere. Okay, that makes sense to me. But if we think about the past 100 years and what's happened there, well, now we can start thinking about industrial revolution types of things, where we've been burning fossil fuels like coal and other carbon-containing compounds like oil and petroleum. Now we can start to think, well, goodness, past 100 years must be because of some sort of combustion type of process. And you're like, wow, that's kind of crazy. We're going to have to watch that a little bit. Going to carbon dioxide, though, if we think about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that has actually increased by 30% just in the past 60 years. Right? Which is really remarkable. Okay, that has gone from 300 parts per million to 400 parts per million in 60 years. That's mind-blowing. Just absolutely insane to think about. If we think about how that compares with the last 400,000 years, that is the highest level that has ever been reached. Now, if we also look at the past 400,000 years, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere tends to be on about a 50,000 year cycle. Up and down, up and down. But once again, we have far exceeded that cycle. Okay. And really this started right around the year 1800. Which, once again, if you think about the start of the Industrial Revolution, that lines up pretty well. Levels in the atmosphere were about 280 parts per million at that time. Once again, now we're at 400. So, quite an increase. But once again, if you look at the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you still see them increase and decrease to some degree every single year. If you look at that, it's a very, very minor amount. Okay, those variations really only vary by, I want to say, like 10 or 20 parts per million. And that varies just because of the season, right? You'll have an increase in global CO2 concentrations during the winter, and you'll have a decrease during the summer once we have all the plants out and photosynthesizing, because they will take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce oxygen. But once again, those are tiny variations on this giant curve that's basically a straight line. Alright, it's really quite pronounced. So yeah, you might see these little yearly variations, but there are yearly variations in the middle of a giant line that is going upward. And this giant line going upward is not only representing carbon dioxide concentrations, it's also representing global temperatures. And they tend to line up pretty well. Now, they don't line up perfectly because carbon dioxide is not the sole contributor to greenhouse gases in the greenhouse effect. Okay. And if we think about the rate that carbon dioxide has been increasing lately, it's been increasing at a rate of 3 parts per million per year, which is 100 or 200 times faster than that's basically ever happened, which is really quite phenomenal. If we think of some of the reasoning for that, why these rates of increase in carbon dioxide are so high in the atmosphere, well, we can actually attribute 25% of them to deforestation, which is to say the typical slash and burn technique that you'll find in a rainforest. Now note, this is not only in rainforests, but that's definitely one of the more popular routes to go with that particular argument. Additionally, what we can think of is how these rates of CO2 levels increasing are related to other rates. Most notably, how CO2 levels relate to photosynthesis rate. Because you know what? People are absolutely right in thinking, well, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, there's going to be more photosynthesis happening. Because the plants will be like, yay, there's more carbon dioxide available, so we're going to take more carbon dioxide in, we're going to create more glucose, we're going to create more tissue, more leaves and such, and it'll be great. Be a great day. And you know what? They're absolutely right. That does help plants. However, if we actually sit down and look at it, as global temperatures increase, not only does photosynthesis increase, but also the also another process called photorespiration increases. This increases as a result of increased temperatures, which is what we're also experiencing at the same time as increased carbon dioxide levels. So although we're having more carbon dioxide, we're also having more temperature. And unfortunately, more temperature results in more photorespiration. Photorespiration is basically where a plant uses its own energy to support its own life. So it's kind of wasting its own energy. It's almost like a tax on the energy that produces from sunlight that doesn't get to go to other animals. So it's essentially waste, if you want to call it that. Now, if we think about what happens with photorespiration, basically the same kind of process that happens with us when we respirate. We take in oxygen, we produce CO2. It's the same thing plants end up doing in high temperatures. So as temperatures increase, they end up doing the same type of thing we do, even though we kind of don't want them to do that. So between these two forces, temperature and CO2 level, we don't quite see a balance or an offset. Which is to say, there have been studies that have shown that with a 14% increase in CO2 in the atmosphere, well, we only see an 11% increase in plant growth over a 20-year period. What that means is that there's still a 3% decrease in productivity. And that is to say, 3% of that CO2 increase is being wasted because of photorespiration. So even though it might, from the surface, seem like, oh yeah, well, the environment's adapting just fine. You know, the plants are increasing their production to counter the CO2 production in the atmosphere. We'll be fine. Truth is, no, we won't. Because there's still a discrepancy. If plant growth was greater than the CO2 change, then I would agree with you. but it's not. It's not enough to keep up. The plants will not outgrow and take care of our CO2 problem. We have to do that. That is all on us, 100% of the way. And that's because of that 3% discrepancy. Now, another topic that I have to talk about, because I've mentioned it in this particular discussion, is methane. Right, we discussed the possibility that maybe methane-producing bacteria are what generated the PT extinction, or at least contributed to it. So we have to mention methane because it's actually a very, 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 very potent greenhouse gas. In fact, it can be 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide is. However, if you look at the concentration of methane in the atmosphere, it's actually only present at 1/200th of the concentration of CO2, which is to say, CO2 is at about 400 parts per million, methane is at about 2 parts per million. Given the huge difference between those two, and the fact that methane is only 25 times more potent per molecule than carbon dioxide, we basically can only attribute methane as really being responsible for about 12% of global warming. 12% of the entirety of global warming is due to methane. The other 88% is due primarily to carbon dioxide. That's still our major focus and our major enemy in global climate change. So then you have some people come up and start encouraging you to go vegan, right? Because cows are a major producer of methane, so clearly we can get rid of that 12% by, not eating cows. Well, the truth of the matter is that really most of our sources for methane, almost 2/3 of all of our sources for methane actually come from other industries. From coal usage and production, from natural gas usage and production, and from a number of other sources, from landfills and such. Those are significant sources of methane that account for 2/3 of all methane that we put up into the air. So really being incredibly optimistic for the sake of the vegans. Being vegan, if everyone on the planet turned vegan, it would really only help global warming by 5%. Just because of the methane. That's it. That is absolutely all it would contribute. 5%. That would solve 1/20th of the problem. Which is to say it would do next to nothing. So when somebody comes up to you and says that you should go vegan for the sake of the environment, that's complete crap, and they don't know what the heck they're talking about. Because honestly, every other aspect of global warming is far more important. Exercising energy efficiency and control in your home, utilizing efficient vehicles, public transportation, bicycles. All these things affect CO2 levels far more, and global greenhouse gas levels far more than going vegan. Okay? Going vegan is a penny in the bucket. You need to contribute dollars into that bucket, and you do that through focusing on CO2 levels, which are far more important for global warming. And you have to keep in mind that this data that we're talking about for global warming is not just the result of one study. Okay? This data is collected from ice cores all over the world, most notably in Antarctica. But these are collected from independent researchers who are funded from various sources and are associated with various agencies and universities and whatever, don't necessarily know each other, and somehow 97% of all climate scientists agree that global climate change is occurring. Because, once again, we've seen other creatures do it in the past. Why is it so hard for us to believe that we're doing it now? The tiniest organism, a bacterium on the planet, that has changed the face of this planet, has changed the entire climate of this planet. in the past. Why is it so hard for us to understand that we are doing it now? It just baffles my mind. It's a no-brainer. If you look at all the climate papers published in 2013, you will see that out of almost 11,000 papers, only 2 papers did not support what we call anthropogenic global warming, or AGW. Only 2 papers out of 11,000. So no, there is no climate gate. There's no worldwide conspiracy on this stuff. It really is happening, and it really does require action from you and your community. Try and minimize our carbon footprint and try to become more efficient and better at equilibrating with our environment without necessarily putting more carbon up into the air, which is increasing the temperature of the entire planet and basically throwing every local weather system and therefore climate out of whack. That's why we've been experiencing these weird weather patterns lately, because the climate is changing and the overall temperature of the entire planet is increasing. That's just throwing every other system out of whack. So just consider these things when you're thinking about global climate change, that you can really make a difference, and that the power is within us as a society to turn this thing around before we aren't able to, before it's too late and all these changes are irreversible. So thank you so much for joining me today on Based on Facts. My name is Christopher Rex. You can find Based on Facts on YouTube and Facebook just by typing Based on Facts in the search bar. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a great week.